In the high-security prison in Bruxelles, located in Baden-Württemberg, inmate Sebastian Weber was serving a 12-year sentence for aggravated robbery. The crime took place in the fall of 2014, when he and two accomplices robbed a cash transport vehicle in Karlsruhe. No one was injured, but the haul amounted to €240,000. Weber was 26 years old at the time of his arrest. Now, in 2021, he had already served 7 years of his sentence. The prison administration described Weber as a model inmate. His files showed no disciplinary measures whatsoever. He worked reliably in the prison laundry, regularly participated in educational programs, and showed interest in vocational training. Psychological reports attested to his low propensity for aggression and genuine desire for rehabilitation. Weber himself rarely spoke about his past. When he did, it was with palpable remorse. He had disappointed his family, he told social workers. His mother had broken off contact. His father had died 3 years after his imprisonment, without Weber having had the opportunity for reconciliation. The monotony of everyday prison life was broken in February 2021 by a new initiative. The Bruxelles Correctional Facility introduced a pen pal program designed to bring prisoners together with volunteers from civil society. The project was sponsored by a non-profit organization dedicated to the rehabilitation of offenders. Only inmates with impeccable behavior and no history of violent crimes against persons were allowed to participate. Weber met these criteria. One of the volunteers was Lena Hoffmann, a 27-year-old graphic designer from Freiburg im Breisgau. Hoffmann lived alone in a small 2-room apartment in the Viera district. She worked freelance for various advertising agencies and had a special talent for visual communication. Her work had won several awards. Despite her professional success, she described herself as lonely. Her last relationship had ended 2 years ago. Since then, she had buried herself in her work. Hoffmann had signed up for the letter-writing program after reading a newspaper article about the importance of social ties for the reintegration of offenders. At the information event in January 2021, she told the organizers that she wanted to give people a second chance. "Everyone deserves to be heard," she said. The mandatory background check revealed nothing unusual. Hoffmann had no criminal record, no connections to organized crime, and no family ties to inmates. The first letter Hoffmann sent to Weber was dated March 2021. She introduced herself, described her profession, and explained her motivation for participating in the program. She avoided questions that might seem too personal or intrusive. Instead, she asked about his daily life, his interests, and his hopes for the future. Weber replied 3 days later. His letter was polite but reserved. He thanked her for her interest and described his daily routine in prison. He mentioned that he liked to read, especially historical novels and biographies. He also wrote that he sometimes drew, even though he wasn't very talented at it. In the weeks that followed, a regular exchange developed. Hoffmann wrote about her work, about exhibitions she had visited, and about her thoughts on social issues. Weber slowly opened up. He told her about his childhood in a small village near Offenburg, about a father who was an alcoholic and a mother who held everything together until she could no longer do so. He described how he ran away from home at 16, how he fell into bad company, and how a chain of unfortunate decisions had ultimately landed him in prison. Hoffmann responded with compassion, but without pity. She encouraged him not to let his past define him. In a letter in May, she wrote, "We are not the sum of our mistakes, but the result of what we learn from them." These words touched Weber deeply. He carried the letter with him for weeks. Over time, the letters took on a different character. Weber wrote more openly about his feelings, about the loneliness that overwhelmed him at night, about his fear of the time after his release. Hoffmann responded with a warmth that went beyond mere politeness. She shared her own vulnerabilities, talked about her failed relationship, about the difficulty of forming genuine connections in an increasingly superficial world. Prison mail was routinely checked but not censored, as long as there were no rule violations. The letters between Weber and Hoffmann contained nothing inappropriate. On the contrary, the staff noticed positive changes in Weber. He seemed more balanced, participated more actively in group discussions, and showed interest in preparing for life after prison. In July 2021, Weber wrote a letter that reached a new level. He confessed to Hoffmann that her letters had become the most important thing in his life. "When I wake up in the morning," he wrote, "my first thought is whether I will receive mail from you today. You have given me back something I thought I had lost forever, the hope that I can be more than my past." Hoffmann's reply came faster than usual. She wrote that she, too, felt the letters were an important part of her life. She had been searching for a long time for someone who would really listen without judging. In Weber, she had found that person. The tone of her words had become intimate. She began to address him by his first name instead of Mr. Weber. He did the same. Between August and December 2021, the correspondence intensified. They wrote to each other twice a week, sometimes more often. The prison mail lists documented 34 letters from Hoffmann to Weber and 32 in the opposite direction. The letters became longer, more personal, more emotional. Weber described Hoffmann as the person who sees who I really am. Hoffmann wrote that for the first time in years she felt completely understood. In December, Weber took a decisive step. In a 7-page letter, he explained his feelings to Hoffmann. He wrote that gratitude had turned into affection, and affection into something deeper. He knew how absurd it might sound, a prisoner falling in love with someone he had never met. But the feelings were real, and he could no longer hide them. He wanted to be honest, even if it meant she would break off contact. Hoffmann's reply took 2 weeks to arrive. Weber spent this time in agonizing uncertainty. Had he ruined everything? When the letter finally arrived, it was short but clear. Hoffmann wrote that she reciprocated his feelings. She too had tried to ignore what had grown between them, but it had become impossible. She wanted to meet him in person, to see if what they had built through words could also endure in reality. In January 2022, Hoffmann submitted a formal request for a visitation permit. The prison administration reviewed the request in accordance with existing guidelines for the letter program. Since there were no concerns, permission was granted. The first visit took place on February 21st, 2022. The meeting lasted 45 minutes and took place under supervision in the general visiting room. The staff described the atmosphere as calm and emotional. Weber had carefully prepared for the visit, shaved, neatly combed his hair, and dressed in clean prison clothes. Hoffman wore a simple dress and had her hair tied back in a braid. They spoke quietly to each other, occasionally smiling, sometimes with tears in their eyes. When the time was up, they said goodbye with a brief handshake. Nothing more was allowed. After this meeting, the tone of the letters changed again. Weber wrote of a feeling of completeness he had never experienced before. Hoffman described the meeting as confirmation of what she already knew, that there was something special between them. She visited him 3 more times in the following months. Each meeting was harmonious. In June 2022, Hoffman made a surprising proposal. In a letter, she wrote that she had been thinking about marrying him. She knew that this was unusual and that many people would not understand, but she believed in him and in their future together. Marriage would give him additional visiting rights and allow them to create a real foundation for the time after his release. Weber was overwhelmed. In his reply, he wrote that he never thought he could deserve such happiness. He accepted her proposal without hesitation. The bureaucratic steps were initiated. After background checks and mandatory counseling sessions, the wedding took place on September 3, 2022. The prison chaplain conducted the ceremony in a secure room. 2 correctional officers acted as witnesses. Weber cried during the ceremony. Hoffman held his hands tightly and spoke her vows in a firm voice. The officers who supervised the ceremony later described the scene as touching. One of them said that in 20 years of service he had rarely seen so much genuine emotion. After the wedding, Weber and Hoffman hugged briefly. Then Weber was led back to his cell block. Hoffman left the prison as the wife of an inmate. The marriage opened up new possibilities. As a married couple, they were entitled to long-term visits in a private visiting room. These visits could last up to 4 hours and took place in a less supervised environment. Hoffman submitted a request in October. Approval was granted and the date was set for November 15th. But in the week before the planned visit, Hoffman suddenly cancelled. She cited health reasons. Weber was disappointed but understanding. A new date was set for December 20th. Hoffman cancelled again, this time due to work commitments. The social worker responsible for Weber's case noted in her report that Hoffman seemed somewhat nervous during the telephone cancellation. In early January 2023, Hoffman confirmed a 3rd date, February 4th. A few days before the visit, Weber received a letter from her. It was shorter than usual and contained a puzzling sentence. "There is something I need to tell you face to face. I hope you understand why I waited." Weber read the letter several times. He didn't understand what Hoffman meant, but a vague uneasiness crept over him. He didn't share this feeling with anyone. On the morning of February 4th, he prepared himself carefully as usual. He didn't know that this day would change everything. On the morning of February 4th, 2023, Lena Hoffman entered the visitor control area of the Brut Correctional Facility at 10:37 a.m. The officer on duty, Miss Schuster, noted her arrival in the visitor log. Hoffman was wearing a dark blue cardigan over a white blouse and jeans. Her face looked tense. At the security check, her hands trembled slightly as she opened her handbag. Miss Schuster asked if everything was okay. Hoffman nodded briefly and said she was just a little nervous. After the check was completed, Hoffman was led into the private visiting room. The room was simply furnished with a table, 2 chairs, a small sofa, and a shelf with books. A narrow window offered a view of the courtyard. The door could not be locked from the inside and had a viewing window. The staff carried out hourly visual checks, but no audio monitoring. Sebastian Weber was led into the room at 10:45. He smiled when he saw his wife and walked towards her. They hugged for a long time. Weber sensed that something was different. Hoffman's body was stiff, her embrace less warm than usual. He asked if she was feeling unwell. She replied that they would talk about it in a moment. They sat down on the sofa. Weber took her hand. Hoffman took a deep breath and began to speak. She said she had to confide something in him, something she should have told him earlier. She hadn't found the right words, the right moment, but now she couldn't wait any longer. Weber nodded encouragingly. He thought of various possibilities. Maybe she had health problems, maybe professional difficulties. He was not prepared for what followed. Hoffman explained that she had undergone gender transition 8 years ago. She had been born male, but even as a child, she knew that this did not correspond to her true identity. At 19, she had started taking hormones. At 21, she had undergone surgical reassignment. Legally, she had already changed her name and civil status 5 years ago. All official documents reflected her confirmed identity. Weber let go of her hand. His expression changed. The warmth drained from his face. He stared at her as if he were looking at a stranger. Hoffman continued, speaking more quickly now, explaining that she hadn't wanted to lie, but that she had also been afraid of losing him. She was a woman, she emphasized, in every respect. Her past did not change who she was. Weber stood up abruptly. His voice was quiet, strained. He asked why she hadn't told him this earlier, before the wedding, before the letters. Hoffman also stood up and tried to approach him. She said she had been afraid of exactly this reaction. Weber recoiled. His thoughts were racing. All the letters, all the feelings, the wedding, everything suddenly seemed like a deception to him. He felt betrayed, humiliated. Shame, anger, and confusion mingled in his head. He began to scream. The staff should have heard him, but the next check was not scheduled for another 15 minutes. Hoffman tried to calm him down. She reached out her hand to him. Weber knocked it away. He accused her of lying to him, of abusing his trust. He repeated the word lie over and over again. Hoffman was now crying and tried to explain that she had not deceived anyone, that her feelings were genuine. What exactly happened in the next few minutes could only be partially reconstructed later. At around 11:23 a.m., officers heard raised voices in the adjacent hallway. When they entered the room, they found Hoffman lying on the floor, unconscious but breathing. Weber was standing pressed against the wall, his hands on his head, screaming her name. Hoffman had visible bruises on her neck and cheek, consistent with manual compression. The emergency call was made immediately. Paramedics treated Hoffman in the prison infirmary before she was transferred to the municipal hospital in Karlsruhe. Weber was taken to the isolation cell in handcuffs. During initial medical treatment, Hoffman was found to have bruises and minor neck injuries, but no permanent damage. The internal investigation began on the same day. Prison director Gerhard Vogt ordered a full review. Weber was questioned on February 5th. He sat silently, staring at the table. When asked why he had attacked Hoffman, he replied only, "She lied to me." When the officers demanded more detailed explanations, he remained silent. Hoffman was discharged from the hospital on February 10th. The victim protection officer for the state of Baden-Württemberg offered her psychological counseling and temporary protection. Hoffman declined to press criminal charges. She told the authorities that she just wanted it to be over. She did not give any interviews. Her family was informed but stayed out of the public eye. Weber remained in solitary confinement. His visiting rights were suspended. Mail monitoring was tightened. Within the first 3 weeks after the incident, Weber attempted to write to Hoffman 7 times. The mail was intercepted. The letters contained accusations, allegations, and threats. One read, "You destroyed me. You will pay for this. I will see you again." The psychological department conducted an assessment on February 22nd. The assessor, Dr. Marlene Roth, diagnosed signs of fixation and emotional instability. She recommended transfer to a psychiatric ward. The prison administration refused, as Weber was classified as a security risk. Hoffman withdrew completely. She gave up her apartment in Freiburg and moved in with a friend in Heidelberg. She changed her phone number and email address. Her social media profiles were deleted. She tried to start a new life, but the fear remained. Weber sat in his cell and thought about everything. The anger slowly turned into something colder, more calculating. He began to make plans. In his mind, Hoffman had become the source of all his suffering. He couldn't accept that he himself was responsible for his reaction. Instead, he blamed her. This obsession would drive him in the months to come. The prison authorities had no idea how deep Weber's determination ran. They treated him as just another difficult case, not a ticking time bomb. That was their first mistake. Many more would follow. In the weeks after the incident, Sebastian Weber developed a dangerous routine. Outwardly, he appeared calm and cooperative. He attended mandatory therapy sessions, answered questions tersely but politely, and showed no overt aggression. The prison psychologist noted a superficial improvement in her report, dated March 12th. Weber spoke about his crime with remorse, she wrote. In reality, Weber had only one thing on his mind: freedom and revenge. In April, Weber was transferred back to the general population. He was reassigned to work in the laundry. The staff saw this as a positive sign of his rehabilitation. No one noticed that Weber valued the laundry for another reason. It gave him access to areas that were normally out of his reach. The prison laundry not only processed inmates' clothing, but also staff uniforms and textiles from the infirmary. Trucks delivered detergent and collected trash on a weekly basis. These deliveries were monitored, but not as strictly as visitor contacts. Weber found his opportunity in this grey area. An informal network existed among the inmates. Goods and information were traded. Weber, who had never participated in such activities before, began cautiously making contacts. He offered cigarettes that he received from other inmates. He did small favors. Slowly, he built trust. In May, Weber achieved his first goal. A fellow inmate named Kai Buschmann, who had contacts on the outside, gave him the number of a former inmate. This man, Dirk Neubauer, had been released 3 months earlier. Neubauer had worked with Weber several times during his imprisonment. They were not friends, but Neubauer owed Weber a favor from a previous altercation in which Weber had lied for him. The problem was communication. Prisoners were only allowed to make monitored phone calls. Letters were read. Weber needed another way. In early June, he found the solution by chance. A maintenance worker who regularly carried out repairs in the laundry room accidentally dropped an old key. Weber found it and realized that it fit a cabinet in the maintenance room. He tested it at night when he was working alone in the laundry room. The cabinet contained tools and spare parts. Weber hid the key. Buschmann provided Weber with a modified smartphone. It arrived in a package of laundry detergent, sealed in plastic and hidden between the bottles. The delivery was scanned as usual, but the small device was positioned so that it looked like part of the packaging on the X-ray. Weber took it out during his night shift and hid it in the maintenance cabinet. From the end of June, Weber led a double life. During the day, he was the model prisoner. At night, when he was alone in the laundry room, he used the phone. The calls were short and encrypted. Neubauer quickly understood what Weber wanted. Weber needed help to escape. He needed a place to hide afterwards, and he needed an address. Neubauer hesitated at first. Assisting an escape meant severe punishment. But Weber convinced him with a combination of threats and promises. He mentioned compromising information about Neubauer's activities during his time in prison. At the same time, he offered money that he could allegedly access after his release. Neubauer agreed. The planning took weeks. Weber studied routines, weak points, possibilities. He observed when maintenance vehicles arrived, which drivers were careless, where cameras had weak spots. He wrote everything down in a code that only he understood, on small scraps of paper that he destroyed after memorizing them. In August, Weber learned from Neubauer that Lena Hoffmann had moved to Heidelberg. Neubauer had asked an acquaintance to discreetly investigate. The address was sent to Weber in an encrypted text message, Bergheimer Straße 54. Weber memorized it. The plan took shape. Weber would escape during a court transport. These transports took place in minibuses with only 2 officers. The route took them along country roads. A mechanical breakdown, arranged by sabotage, would force the vehicle to stop. Weber would disappear in the confusion. Sabotage was the biggest risk. Weber did not work in vehicle maintenance, but he knew someone who did. Malte Herbst, an inmate with mechanical skills, serviced the prison vehicles. Weber approached him in September. He offered him protection from a group of inmates who were threatening Herbst. In return, Herbst was to slightly damage the brake line during the next maintenance of transporter number 7. It would not be immediately dangerous, but after a 20-kilometer drive, the brake system would fail. Herbst hesitated for a long time. Weber increased the pressure. Finally, Herbst agreed. On October 3rd, he carried out the sabotage. No one noticed. The inspection afterwards was superficial. Weber waited for the right moment. His next court date was set for November 15th. It was the hearing regarding the attack on Hoffmann. Weber was accused of assault. He would receive additional years to his sentence. But he did not intend to live to see this hearing. On the evening of November 14th, Weber received a final message from Neubauer. "Everything is ready." Weber deleted the message and hid the phone in the maintenance closet one last time. He would no longer need it. The next morning, he would be free, and then he would find Lena Hoffmann. November 15th, 2023, began with thick fog over Baden-Württemberg. Transporter number 7 left the Bruxelles Correctional Facility at 8:12 a.m. with 3 prisoners on board. Sebastian Weber sat in the middle row, handcuffed and shackled. The 2 judicial officers, Mr. Metzger and Mr. Schilling, checked the security measures and set off for the Karlsruhe Regional Court. The route took them along Federal Highway 33. Traffic was normal for a Wednesday morning. Metzger drove while Schilling checked the paperwork. Weber sat quietly and looked out the window. His calmness was calculated. He knew that in about 25 minutes it would all begin. At 8:37 a.m., shortly after the Ubstadtweiher exit, Metzger noticed a problem. The brake pedal felt spongy. He pressed it several times. The resistance decreased. Schilling asked what was wrong. Metzger replied that something was wrong with the brakes. He tried to slow down, but the vehicle barely responded. With difficulty, Metzger steered the van to a rest area. The vehicle rolled to a stop. Both officers got out to assess the damage. A puddle of brake fluid had formed under the vehicle. Metzger cursed and grabbed the radio to call for assistance. Weber seized the moment. He asked Schilling if he could use the restroom at the rest stop. Schilling hesitated, but the regulations allowed it under supervision. He opened the door and helped Weber out. The leg irons remained on, as did the handcuffs. They walked slowly to the restroom, about 20 meters away. Metzger was on the phone with headquarters and had his back turned to them. The other 2 prisoners were still sitting in the van. Schilling led Weber to the door of the toilet block. It was an older building with narrow windows. Weber asked to go in alone because he was embarrassed. Schilling refused and stood outside the door. What Weber did next was something he had been planning for weeks. He had secretly worked on one of the handcuff locks in the laundry room and weakened it by repeatedly manipulating it. With a quick jerk, which he had practiced 100 times, the lock broke open. His hands were free. Weber squeezed through the small window of the toilet, which Schilling couldn't see. It was tight, but he was slim enough. He fell onto the other side into some bushes. The shackles hindered him, but he was able to move forward. He heard Schilling calling, then getting louder. Weber crawled through the undergrowth toward an adjacent wooded area. Schilling had meanwhile broken down the door and discovered that Weber was gone. His shout alerted Metzger, Both officers ran around the building, but Weber already had a 30-meter head start. In the forest, Weber moved as fast as his shackles would allow. He followed a dry creek bed that provided cover. After about 200 meters, he reached a spot where Neubauer had hidden a package. A small backpack hung in a hollow tree trunk. Inside, bolt cutters, clothes, 500 euros in cash, and directions. Weber cut through the shackles. The metal gave way with a sharp crack. He changed his clothes, buried the prison uniform, and moved on. The directions led him to an abandoned farm 3 kilometers away. Neubauer had left an old bicycle there. Meanwhile, the manhunt was underway. At 9:15 a.m., the alarm was sent to all police stations in the region. Roadblocks were set up, helicopters took off. But Weber had already left the forest and was riding east on dirt roads. He reached the small village of Helmsheim around 11 a.m. There he parked the bicycle and continued on foot. Neubauer's plan was for Weber to take the regional train to Heidelberg, but Weber knew that train stations were under surveillance. Instead, he stole an older VW Golf that was unlocked and parked in a driveway in a residential area. The key was in the glove compartment, a careless mistake that played into his hands. Weber drove to Heidelberg on side roads, avoiding highways and main traffic arteries. The trip took 2 hours. He parked the car in a wooded area outside the city and walked the last few kilometers on foot. Neubauer had not only given him Hoffmann's address, but also information about her routine. She worked from home and rarely left the apartment. The building on Bergheimer Strasse was a 4-story-old building without a doorman. Hoffmann lived on the 3rd floor. Weber spent the night in an empty shed behind a supermarket. He couldn't sleep. Thoughts were spinning around in his head. The humiliation he had felt, the betrayal, as he called it, the need to bring justice. That's how he justified his plans to himself. The next morning, November 16th, Weber bought a knife at a hardware store on the outskirts of town. He paid cash and wore a baseball cap and sunglasses. The saleswoman didn't pay any particular attention to him. Thousands of knives like this were sold every day. Weber returned to Bergheimer Strasse and watched the building from a distance. Around 2 p.m., he saw Hoffmann at the window. She was on the phone. Even from a distance, her face was familiar to him. Anger rose up in him again. He waited until dark. Around 10 p.m., he approached the building. The front door was secured with a code, but a resident was just coming out and held the door open for Weber, assuming he was also a resident. Weber thanked him and entered. He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. He stopped in front of Hoffmann's door. His heart was pounding. He raised his hand and knocked. He heard footsteps from inside. A voice asked, "Who's there?" Weber did not answer. After a moment, Hoffmann opened the door a crack, the chain still attached. When she recognized Weber, she tried to close the door, but Weber threw himself against it. The chain tore out of the wall. He rushed inside. What happened in the next few minutes was of a brutality that transcended all human limits. Lena Hoffmann stumbled backwards into her apartment. She tried to scream, but Weber pressed one hand over her mouth. With the other, he closed the door behind him. The hallway was narrow. Hoffman hit him, striking his cheek. He pushed her against the wall. Pictures fell down, glass shattered. Weber dragged her into the living room. She fought back desperately. Furniture was knocked over. A lamp fell. Hoffman managed to break free and run to the bedroom door. Weber followed her. He grabbed her by the hair and pulled her back. She screamed, but the walls were thick, and the neighbors either didn't hear or ignored her. In the bedroom, Hoffman fell to the floor. Weber knelt on top of her. She asked why he was doing this. He did not answer with words. His hands closed around her throat. She scratched his arms, leaving bloody marks. He squeezed. Her eyes widened, then he reached for the knife. The forensic examination would later document 10 stab wounds, 8 in the chest area, 2 in the stomach. Hoffman had defensive wounds on both hands. She had fought to the end. The time of death was estimated at 11:15 p.m. Weber sat next to the body for several minutes. His hands were shaking. Blood covered his clothes. He looked at Hoffman's face, which had become rigid and expressionless. At that moment, he felt no remorse, only emptiness. He searched the apartment. On the nightstand, he found letters he had sent her from prison. She had kept them. The marriage certificate was there too. Weber took a photo of the ceremony and put it in his pocket. Then he left the apartment. He met no one in the stairwell. He left the building through the back exit. In a dark alley, he changed the shirt he'd been wearing under his jacket. He stuffed the bloody garment into a trash can. Then he disappeared into the night. Weber wandered through Heidelberg for hours. Around 3 in the morning, he reached the main train station. There, he used his last cash to buy a ticket to Mannheim. The night train was almost empty. No one paid any attention to him. He got off in Mannheim and slept in an abandoned warehouse. When he woke up, his hands were still smeared with blood. He washed them in a public toilet, but the memory could not be washed away. On the morning of November 17th, the Heidelberg police received a call. Hoffmann's sister, who lived in Munich, had tried in vain to reach him. She asked the police to check on him. 2 officers drove to Bergheimer Strasse 54. They rang the doorbell. No answer. The front door was open. Someone had not closed it properly. The officers went upstairs. The door to Hoffmann's apartment was ajar. They called out, silence. When they entered, they saw the devastation in the hallway, broken glass, overturned furniture. They followed the trail to the bedroom. There they found Lena Hoffmann. She was lying on her back, partially covered by a sheet. The officers immediately secured the apartment and called for backup. The Heidelberg Criminal Investigation Department took over the case. Chief Inspector Thomas Engel led the investigation. Forensic investigators photographed every inch of the apartment. They found fingerprints on the door handle, the door frame, and the nightstand. They found the knife in the trash can in the courtyard, wrapped in newspaper. DNA traces were secured. During the course of the day, the police identified the victim as Lena Hoffmann. A database check revealed her connection to Sebastian Weber. When the officers learned that Weber had been on the run for 2 days, the manhunt was intensified. A connection seemed obvious. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death, bleeding to death from multiple stab wounds, exacerbated by strangulation. Hoffmann had no drugs or alcohol in her blood. She had died fully conscious. The injuries showed that she had fought back violently. In the days that followed, the police reconstructed Weber's escape route. Witnesses remembered a man who resembled the composite sketch. Surveillance cameras showed him at the Heidelberg train station. The trail led to Mannheim, then disappeared. Weber himself moved aimlessly through the region. His money was gone. He stole food from supermarkets. He slept in ruins and abandoned buildings. The reality of what he had done slowly dawned on him, but he felt no remorse, only fear of being caught. On November 21st, he was spotted in a wooded area near Ludwigshafen. A hunter recognized him from media reports and alerted the police. Hundreds of officers surrounded the area. Helicopters circled above the trees. Weber knew it was over. When the officers found him, he was sitting under a tree. He was holding the wedding photo in his hands. It was crumpled and smeared with blood. He looked up as the police approached and carefully placed the photo next to him. Then he raised his hands. The hunt was over. Sebastian Weber was arrested on November 21st, 2023, at 4:40 p.m. The police took him to the Mannheim Remand Center. He remained silent throughout the journey. It was only in the interrogation room, hours later, that he began to speak. Chief Inspector Engel conducted the interrogation. Weber initially denied any involvement. When presented with the forensic evidence, his DNA on the knife, his fingerprints in the apartment, his defense collapsed. He confessed to the crime, but described it as a crime of passion. Hoffmann had betrayed him, he said. She had destroyed his life. Engel confronted him with the truth. Weber had been planning his escape for months. He had bought the knife. He had gone to Hoffmann's apartment deliberately. This was not a crime of passion. It was premeditated murder. The trial began on March 12, 2024, at the Heidelberg Regional Court. The evidence was overwhelming. In addition to the forensic evidence, there were witness statements from Neubauer, who testified against Weber in exchange for a reduced sentence. Malte Herbst also confessed to his role in the sabotage. The prosecution presented a complete picture: planning, execution, intent. The defense tried to argue diminished responsibility. A psychiatrist described Weber as emotionally disturbed after the revelation in prison, but the counter-arguments carried more weight. Weber had planned rationally, acted systematically, and tried to flee after the crime. That spoke against any form of insanity. One detail was particularly damning. Weber had used his cell phone during his escape and recorded a video. In it, he said, "I did what had to be done. She betrayed me, and now justice has been served." The video showed no remorse, only cold justification. On March 28th, the verdict was handed down. The jury took 3 hours. Guilty of murder, guilty of fleeing, guilty of endangering others during the sabotage. Weber showed no reaction when the verdict was read out. The sentence, life imprisonment, with a finding of particular severity of guilt. This meant that Weber could apply for release after 25 years at the earliest. Judge Benedikt Schmidt justified the verdict with the particular cruelty and complete disregard for human life. Weber was transferred to the high-security wing of the Freiburg prison. He will probably spend the rest of his life there. Lena Hoffmann was buried in Freiburg. Her family did not give any interviews. A written statement said she wanted to be loved for who she was, that love cost her her life. The case sparked a debate in Germany about how transgender people are treated. Activists called for better protection against violence. Others discussed prison programs and their monitoring. Sebastian Weber himself has not commented further. The crumpled wedding photo still hangs in his cell, a silent witness to a life destroyed by hatred and misunderstanding.